Jack Dorsey is now talking about how Bitcoin cannot be stopped by BlackRock and large institutions. However, he sees a severe scenario approaching us that could potentially push Bitcoin into irrelevance. He warns here and says very clearly, this must change. This is how Bitcoin will fail. We look at why he is currently bullish on one hand and sees many positive developments. But on the other hand, he also speaks very cautionary words. And he says things here that many people do not want to hear. We are going to watch his entire interview. This is highly explosive, because whenever Jack Dorsey talks about Bitcoin, the Bitcoin world listens. Jack Dorsey is a Bitcoin OG who has been around for a very long time. He is a former co-founder of Twitter, and now has his own Bitcoin company with Block. And now we're going to watch the interview. I've picked out the best scenes, so you don't have to watch the entire interview. The whole thing is really highly explosive. Before we look at the big warning, let's first see why he is so optimistic about Bitcoin. What makes Bitcoin special here, and what his take on BlackRock and the big financial giants is.
What makes Bitcoin special, what makes things like Nostr special, is they're permissionless. You don't need anyone's permission to build what you want to see. And that's just incredible. Like to be able to work on a money transmission protocol that's entirely open, that has no one leader, that has all this attention, that has converted the likes of BlackRock or these major institutions that were these things that we railed against in the past. And now they have to turn their attention to it. And yet you still don't need their permission to build on it or to change it or to better it. Where else can you find that? Like at that scale? Nowhere.
That means you can now start a Bitcoin company here. You can start doing something on the Bitcoin protocol. Yes, doing some second layer stuff, developing Lightning, further developing Bitcoin Core, and so on. I mean, of course, there are certain limitations. In certain countries, there are restrictions again. There are regulations again. That means, yes, it is permissionless at the protocol level, but the further you move away from the protocol level, and the more you interact with the traditional fiat money system, then you have to admit, there are certain limitations here. I mean, it's not by chance that, for example, companies leave Germany and then go to the USA or, for example, to El Salvador. But the really striking thing he says here is, hey, BlackRock and so on, the big players, whether they are asset managers or big banks, JP Morgan and so on, these people also have to adhere to the permissionless system here. That means BlackRock can't later say, okay, I now have 2 million Bitcoin, and now I'm going to restrict the Bitcoin network, and now I'm going to prohibit some people here from trading Bitcoin or restrict certain activities for some people. It's really striking that the crossroads were here before the big players. And that's the brilliant thing about Bitcoin, that we have a censorship-resistant technology here. We don't have to ask anyone, a permissionless technology, and BlackRock are not the first movers, but rather the latecomers here. And BlackRock has now understood, hey, they need to catch up here. Because if they don't, this could become a big problem for them. But it gets even more exciting here.
In only 16 years. So imagine the next 16 years and how you can contribute to it. Again, only asking yourself permission. Like that, it's just an incredible thing to be a part of. And it reminds me so much of the earlier internet where, again, the default was you didn't need permission to do anything. We see more and more of that going away, and Bitcoin and Nostr and hopefully something in intelligence will be the antidote to that and bring us back to like what made the internet special in the first place and what made it magic. So permissionless, that's the one thought.
His great hope is then that we as a society will drift over to a permissionless society here. At the moment, it's like you have to ask the government for every little thing. Whether I can marry my wife, whether I can have a new pet, whether I can expand my house, whether I can build a garden shed there, whether I can open a bank, whether I can open a butcher shop. No matter what, you need everything, a license, a permission, this, that, and the other. And with Bitcoin, that simply doesn't exist. You don't have to call the government and ask, hey, can I make a transaction now? Hey, sorry, can I now do this on my hardware wallet address or something? By the way, I'll put a link in for you to a hardware wallet, how you can easily and securely store your Bitcoin on a hardware wallet here. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you also get 10% off here. In any case, now the warnings are coming. Now the really critical parts from Jack Dorsey are coming. And now, attention, listen very carefully. Now it's exactly about how Bitcoin can fail. The reporter asks him here, hey, we're going into the future now. How could it be that Bitcoin has failed?
I think it fails through irrelevance. Like it fails to be relevant to people on a daily basis. If it just ends up being store value and nothing more, I don't think it gains relevance at all. Like I think it has to be payments for it to be relevant on the everyday. Otherwise, it's just something you kind of buy and forget and only use in emergency situations or when you want to get liquid again. So I think if it doesn't transition to payments and find that everyday use case, it just gets increasingly irrelevant. And that's failure to me.
So folks, I'm telling you honestly, don't talk nonsense here. It is indeed a scenario that can become dangerous for Bitcoin. And I've also thought a lot about it. How can Bitcoin fail? What would need to happen? Seferi Namus has always said it. He always brought up the scenario. Okay, what if central banks return to a hard money standard? What if central banks suddenly start implementing good monetary policy again? What if the fiat money system suddenly starts working well again? Then Bitcoin would become irrelevant here. That means Jack Dorsey is now making the pitch and saying, hey, it will become irrelevant if people only use it as a store of value. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because, in my estimation alone, Bitcoin as a store of value is already such a groundbreaking invention, such a monumental achievement for humanity, that this part alone already makes Bitcoin the ultimate hypervalhalla asset, and Bitcoin will really shoot up to millions, to several millions. That means we don't necessarily need the payment option here. That would, of course, be on top, another bombshell, that would further push Bitcoin, so that it's not just a reserve asset. As Larry Fink has also said, Bitcoin can be the reserve asset that even replaces the US dollar, but that it even becomes a world currency. That means we have Bitcoin transactions everywhere. Everyone uses Bitcoin, and so on. But back to the chaos scenario. How Bitcoin can fail, which, in the current situation, to be honest, must be said, is very, very unrealistic. Because you have to ask yourselves now, how realistic is it that central banks, for example, will return to solid monetary policy? That, for example, we go back to a hard money standard. Maybe a gold-based system, a gold-backed currency, or something like that. I mean, I don't know either, 100%, whether that would lead to Bitcoin failing. But it would definitely massively slow down the adoption of Bitcoin. Then what we might do in 10 years, we might do in 30 or 40 years. But at the moment, we are seeing exactly the opposite trends. That means Jerome Powell, Christine Lagarde, and so on, all those clowns. They don't really have a grip on monetary policy, so to speak. There was a central banker here in the USA, I think from Boston or something, the Fed president, who said, hey, we actually don't have a plan. And basically, monetary policy has slipped out of our hands. And I believe that many central bankers will have to openly admit this in the future, or then the money will just hyperinflate, explode, or whatever. That means at the moment, it doesn't look like Bitcoin is failing. It looks exactly the opposite. But still, the scenario here from Jack Dorsey is very, very relevant. And you can also feel free to write down below in the comments, because the point that Jack Dorsey makes here is indeed justified. Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. That's stated right at the top in the white paper, and Jack Dorsey is always a big advocate here. He also says if, for example, Bitcoin doesn't establish itself as a means of payment, then he would move to another project. He actually said that in another video, in another interview. And Jack Dorsey is a staunch advocate that Bitcoin must establish itself as a payment medium. Otherwise, Bitcoin will fail. This means we have different opinions here. Jack Dorsey says Bitcoin will fail if it doesn't establish itself as a payment medium, because it will then disappear into irrelevance. I would say no, Bitcoin will not disappear into irrelevance even without being a payment medium. But feel free to write your comments below.
What do you think that we can do to mitigate that risk that led to failure?
I think, building simple, accessible experiences that solve the payment use case, making it scale, making it fast, like giving the speed of the Visa and MasterCard networks real competition. I think all that changes, and there's tons of projects to do that, and that it continues to increase in privacy and security and ultimately safety.
So the question here is, what can be done to push Bitcoin forward as a payment network so that Bitcoin does not disappear into irrelevance? And he simply says, building better tools. He also talks about more privacy, more security. This is also a topic that, for example, Snowden always talks about. His major criticism is that Bitcoin will fail if the privacy issue is not resolved, because Bitcoin has a privacy issue here, as it is not anonymous at the baseline, but pseudonymous. I don't see it as a point of failure either, but there are different opinions. And that was basically the solution on how the whole thing can be improved. I mean, Jack Dorsey is also working on it himself. I mean, you can also work on it by simply paying with Bitcoin. I'm in El Salvador, and I can pay a lot with Bitcoin there. Just ask your vendor, hey, can I pay with Bitcoin? Then go to the supermarket and ask, hey, can I buy the bananas with Bitcoin? Then go to the shoe store. Ask, hey, can I buy the shoes with Bitcoin? And if enough people ask, they will eventually respond and offer Bitcoin payment. I've seen this happen many, many times. And now there's another danger here. This isn't a warning where Jack Dorsey says Bitcoin could fail because of this. But this is a big, big danger that you currently see here in the Bitcoin network, which many, many people underestimate.
What are you currently most excited by in the Bitcoin space right now?
Mining, like our team's mining rig. I just think it's important. I think it's another point of centralization that we can help diminish and further decentralize. And we'll have our system, but I'm excited to see what other people build with it and how they customize it.
This is very, very interesting now, because asked here, I'm curious about what others will build with the system and how they will customize it. Really have a very good payment medium, with Bitcoin establishing itself here on multiple levels. And that's why he says what interests him the most right now is here, mining, because there are still certain problems he sees here. He sees centralization problems here. And that's always a story with mining. We have the mining pools, some say. Okay, there are certain problems here, centralization problems, because there's somehow mining pools centralization and so on. And yes, to a certain extent that might be true, but mining pools are also just service providers, and you can change or modify a mining pool or something like that. But he is basically a big fan, for example, of open source mining, which means there isn't much of that yet. For example, there are approaches like with BitAx, where there is an open source mining device, or others talk about open source mining pool protocols or something like that, where you do something in that direction. These are things that probably interest Jack Dorsey. There have actually been a lot of solo miners recently who have found Bitcoin through BitAx. So far, no one has found anything through NerdMiner, but there have been solo miners who are not connected to a pool. Or maybe they are. But no, they were not connected to a pool. So some are connected to a pool. But those who have found an entire block subsidy here, they mine on their own, which means they don't share their payout with other people, like you would in a pool. And what's crazy here is that the BitX miners are actually open source, which means you can basically view all the components. And that's the next thing, meaning not just the mining pools. I think probably that's what Jack Dorsey is criticizing here, but I'm not 100% sure. The next thing is basically the chip manufacturers and where the mining devices come from. It all comes from China. It all comes from Asia and so on. There's a certain centralization. I think it might also be that Block is working on some mining devices or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. But that's definitely another issue that Jack Dorsey sees, that Bitcoin mining should be further decentralized. Okay, and if in the future we don't just have a few big providers, but more and more people, maybe even in home mining, someone might find a Bitcoin block or Bitcoin, there's that. There are visions that Bitcoin could eventually be integrated into every electrical device or into many electrical devices, if it's integrated into some heating systems, integrated into households, and so on, so that the hash rate becomes even more decentralized, reducing large points of attack. And yes, as I said, it's always a philosophical question. Is it really a problem if there's some big mining company here? Or is it actually unproblematic? There are simply different perspectives on this. Jack Dorsey, however, tends to find it rather problematic. It's definitely good to address this and acknowledge that there are certain centralization risks. Often, when you talk to regular people, they say, hey, Bitcoin miners are not a problem at all. But I know Bitcoin miners. And when you talk to them directly, they actually say, yes, there are certain centralization issues here that most people aren't even aware of. In any case, we need to take Jack Dorsey's warning seriously. But we also don't need to overinterpret it. Because fundamentally, Jack Dorsey is still hyper bullish on Bitcoin. He just sees certain things here that he wants to address, which many people might overlook. And if you're also bullish on Bitcoin, I'll put a link below for you. 21 Bitcoin, where you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Guys, see you. Until then, peace out.